Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. A book published later this month makes dramatic revelations about India's relationship with Pakistan. Called India versus Pakistan, Why Can't We Just Be Friends? The book reveals that Lieutenant General Shuja Pasha, as ISI chief, admitted to a former American CIA director that the 2611 attackers had ISI links. The book also reveals that Pakistan has received at least 2 serious warnings from former United States Secretaries of State to stop terrorism against India, but effectively ignored them. Finally, the book claims that Pakistan's Kashmir policy is unstrategic, overwrought and unsophisticated. The country doesn't have a coherent strategy or a well-considered endgame to secure the disputed territory. The author is Pakistan's former ambassador to America and one of the country's foremost political analysts, Husain Haqqani. Tonight, he's my exclusive guest on this program. Husain Haqqani, let's start with what is possibly the most dramatic revelation in your book. You write that when Lieutenant General Shuja Pasha was ISI chief and you were ambassador in America, he visited the United States and met the then CIA director Michael Hayden, and as you write, admitted that the planners of the Mumbai attacks included some retired Pakistani army officers. He also said, and once again I'm quoting you, the attackers had ISI links, but this had not been an authorized ISI operation. How sure are you of this dramatic fact?
Karan, I never write anything that I am not 100% sure of. I always check and recheck. In fact, a similar account of the conversation between General Hayden and General Pasha is to be found in General Hayden's own book, Playing to the Edge, which has just come out in the United States. I also kept meticulous notes and detailed notes of my interaction with American officials as well as with Pakistani officials who were visiting. So General Pasha did say what I have quoted in my book.
Now, in fact, Mr. Haqqani, in the very next paragraph, you write, and I'm quoting you again, at my official residence as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, Pasha said to me in Urdu, "Log hamare the, operation hamara nahi tha." So if ISI people were involved, but it wasn't an ISI operation, does this mean it was subcontracted or deliberately kept at arm's length?
I think when he said that log hamare the, he did not mean people serving in the ISI. What he meant was that people that the ISI has in the past trained and nurtured. I think he was referring to the LET as hamare log, and that is why my response immediately was, if we are not in control of people that we have trained in the past or have nurtured, then how are we going to be sure that we will be able to stop them when we want to stop them? And that was my concern immediately that I expressed to General Pasha.
But the critical question, Mr. Haqqani, is, did the ISI have full knowledge of the 2611 attacks before they happened? If ISI people, even if they were only at one remove, were involved, did the ISI have full knowledge? And therefore, if it did, was there a sense in which it was complicit?
Look, I have no evidence to offer that they did. The Americans at that stage did not say that there was complicity. They only said that there were people who were connected and therefore they wanted action. They gave names of people like Mr. Lakhvi to be arrested, and he was arrested. Now, what does cast some aspersion on Pakistan's security services is the conduct after. For example, Mr. Lakhvi was detained, but he has never been successfully prosecuted. And that basically makes people wonder whether what General Pasha was admitting to was a little more than what he was admitting to.
So in a sense, General Pasha has opened the door, even if only slightly, to answering the question, how much did the ISI know? When did it know it? And finally, does the fact the ISI hasn't acted toughly against people like Lakhvi or others suggest that in fact the links with the ISI are much closer than officially admitted? He's opened the door to all 3 of those questions.
As a Pakistani, that has been my concern for a long time. I have always been saying when I was in office as ambassador and subsequently that this is something Pakistan has to worry about. We can't sustain the position of just giving technical answers. This person is not really doing it because we asked him to do it, but he's doing it because he happens to be on our territory, and yet we will not take action against him. All those things do make things look very suspicious. It is very interesting that in Karachi, where a massive operation is currently taking place against the MQM, which is Pakistan's fourth largest political party, and also against the Pakistan People's Party, which governs Sindh, there, for example, political workers are being arrested in the name of action against terrorism. But Hafiz Muhammad Saeed, who has been named as a terrorist by many countries, including Pakistan's friends like the United States and the UAE, continues to operate and hold massive rallies in Lahore.
Okay. The big point your book makes, and for us in India, this is the critical news point, is that this is the first time we now have evidence from someone who was sitting there and listening to him that a very senior ISI officer, the director, in fact, the Director General, Lieutenant General Shuja Pasha, actually accepted that 2611 has direct ISI links and opened the possibility that ISI might have had greater knowledge, which we haven't had revealed to us so far. This is the first time this has been established, and you were an eyewitness when the Director General made this admission.
Well, I think that General Hayden himself has said that in his book, so that becomes even more important, because after all, General Hayden and General Pasha had a one-to-one meeting as well, in which I was not present. And so it's at least two occasions on which he has used similar words. Now, my version of it would still be that I don't think he was saying that the organization was complicit formally and officially. What he was saying was that because of the people that they have trained, the people and the organizations that they have created, that the event's responsibility did lie on the Pakistani side, but that it was not a formally, officially authorized Pakistani military or ISI operation.
Now, Mr. Haqqani, your book also reveals details of two very interesting warnings given by America to Pakistan about terror. The first happened soon after the Mumbai attack of 26 November 2008, when the then United States Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice told Pakistan's then National Security Advisor Major General Durrani, and I'm once again quoting from your book, that Pakistan had all the information it needed to shut terrorist operations down forever. You were present at that meeting, and you write that Condoleezza Rice added, focusing your energies on an Indian threat that does not exist is a colossal mistake. We know that the advice was effectively ignored by General Durrani, but what was his response at that time?
Well, he made 3 points. The first point was that, look, the United States bear responsibility because the United States asked Pakistan to engage in similar activities, which it now calls terrorism, in Afghanistan. So it's America's fault that you brought us into this. We did it together. Second point was that Pakistan has a legitimate cause in Kashmir, and so therefore our support of militancy is on that account. And the third point he made was that Pakistan is in the process of severing links with terrorist and jihadi groups, and that there have been no formal and official links between Pakistan's intelligence service and LET since 2002, according to General Durrani in that meeting. And the second thing he said in that connection was that the ISI has had 4 changes of leadership, and they have gone through several layers of cleansing, and still people keep making accusations. On this, Condi Rice actually turned around and said, General, I know that you are being truthful on the basis of what you have been told, but what you have been told is not right. We know that there are other factors going on that you do not seem to know about.
In other words, Condi Rice was indicating to him pretty bluntly that I know more about what the ISI is involved in than you do, even though you're Pakistan's national security advisor.
Well, the National Security Advisor, as you know, had been appointed by the civilian government, even though he was a former military man. And General Durrani, as you know, is known even in India as General Shanti. He's one of those who served in the Pakistani army, and after that has become a strong advocate of normalization of relations with India. So in that sense, he is considered a dove by people in the Pakistani military. And I think Secretary Rice was alluding to that fact, that, you know, since you're a dove, you really don't know what the hawks are doing.
Now, in fact, the second thing you revealed in your book is that roughly 16 years earlier, in May 1992, the then Secretary of State James Baker wrote to Nawaz Sharif, who was Prime Minister at the time, and again, I'm quoting from your book, or maybe in fact I'm quoting from the letter because you have actually seen that letter. Baker said to Sharif that he had to take steps to make certain that Kashmir and Sikh groups and individuals who have committed acts of terrorism don't receive support from Pakistani officials. Sharif, you say, wrote back with a long letter, but Pakistan continued to use terror against India. Why do you think in these two instances, America was only able to advise and warn, but it did nothing more?
I don't think it's a question of ability. I think it's a question of choice. In fact, Secretary Baker's letter in 1992 threatened Pakistan with it being declared a state sponsor of terrorism. We were very concerned at that time. Then the government changed in Pakistan and Benazir Bhutto came to office. And when she came to office, the Americans changed policy, assuming that the new leader will be more amenable to reason and change. And then that threat was withdrawn. But the fact that the threat was given and withdrawn resulted in a kind of impunity in Islamabad as well as in Rawalpindi. And the assumption was, if we can change the leaders, if we can change the faces, the Americans will back off. On the American side, I think the problem is that the Americans usually think in a very linear fashion. And every few years, somebody in America says, well, Pakistan's a nuclear power, we can't isolate it, which is probably true. They are right on that score. But then they never sustain pressure, and they always go from giving carrots to wielding sticks. The stick doesn't take effect before they start offering carrots again. And so this policy basically enables hardliners in Pakistan to make the case, we are too big to fail, we are too important a country to come under anybody's pressure.
In fact, you write the following about how Pakistan responds when it's forced by either US pressure or UN sanctions to tackle terror. And once again, I'm quoting from your book. Groups are banned only to resurface under new names, whilst prominent terrorist masterminds are almost always set free by Pakistani courts. Jihad is officially put on hold sometimes, but it is never completely rolled back. And what you're really saying is that Pakistan acts deliberately half-heartedly. Sometimes the action is only cosmetic, and the world accepts that. So even though America is warning and threatening, it accepts half-hearted action and does no more.
I think that what I have written is actually the truth. Many of us as Pakistanis are very worried about it. There are some Pakistanis who have a lot of faith in General Raheel Sharif's Operation Zarb-e-Azb, which has started a few years ago. There have been more actions against terrorist groups that attack inside Pakistan than ever before. But the anti-India groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed are totally unaffected. The Taliban, who operate in Afghanistan, and the Haqqani network, they are totally untouched. And Mr. Sartaj Aziz, who is now our foreign affairs advisor with the rank of the minister, he basically has said, why should we act against groups that are not operating against us in Pakistan, but are operating against other countries with whom we have inimical relations? So yes, it is a certain Pakistani policy, and yes, the Western nations led by the United States have basically adopted the view that maybe we need to have a more limited approach to Pakistan's acting against terrorism. The Indian-Pakistani equation and even the Afghan-Pakistani equation is not for us to correct. What we should worry about is that they act against terrorists who have acted in the United States or are acting in the United States and share intelligence with us on that. And they act against the terrorist groups that are attacking inside the country. And maybe that is enough. So they are accepting the glass as half full on a regular basis, which then results in half-hearted measures in Pakistan.
In fact, you said something even more important, and I'm going to ask you to simply confirm it with a yes or no. America is happy to permit Pakistan, if that's the right phrase, to continue with its terrorist activity targeted at India, provided Pakistan takes stern action, A, against terrorists that tackle the West, and secondly, against terrorists that are disrupting Pakistan itself. The leeway is granted as far as LET and Jaish is concerned.
I wouldn't phrase it that way, Karan, but what I would say is that the United States has been very, very confused in its handling of Pakistan. And President George W. Bush actually believed General Pervez Musharraf when General Pervez Musharraf used to assure him that that Pakistan is acting against all terrorist groups and it's only a matter of time. Now, that was almost 14, 15 years ago. 15 years is a long enough time to get rid of groups that existed before. And then we are seeing younger and younger terrorists. It means that these people are being recruited and trained now. And so, obviously, the recruitment and training has not stopped. And if the state of Pakistan puts its full weight behind stopping this process, then these younger people should not be able to join these new terrorist groups or old ones. And then old terrorist groups that have been banned should not be allowed to resurface under new names. And people who have been declared terrorists by the international community should be deemed as terrorists in Pakistan as well, which is not happening.
Mr. Haqqani, let's come to Pakistan's attitude towards and its handling of the Kashmir issue, where once again you have some very, very interesting things to say. You write on Kashmir, Pakistan has consistently allowed sentimentality to trump strategic thinking. Much of the Pakistani handling of the state has been unstrategic, overwrought and unsophisticated, both in the past and in the present. Elsewhere, you say, the strong belief in the righteousness of Pakistan's claim to Kashmir has never been accompanied by a coherent strategy or a well-considered end game to get it. That's a pretty damning indictment of your own country's Kashmir strategy.
Well, it sounds damning because it's harsh, but it is factually correct. Look, in 1948, a tribal Lashkar was organized and it was supposed to go and take over Kashmir because Kashmir was a Muslim majority state and therefore should have belonged to Pakistan. But no serious political moves were made to try and reach out to people like Sheikh Abdullah, who was the most popular leader of the Kashmir Valley at that time. That was left to the Congress to do. So in fact, we really didn't have a political plan. But then more than that, we didn't even have a successful military plan. Okay, so the Lashkar goes in, takes over. What next? What happens when the Indians come on side of the Maharaja and try and push the Lashkar back, which is exactly what happened. 1965, Pakistan decides to go into Kashmir and thinks that the people will, there will be a mass uprising of the people against the Indian government, but India will not strike on Pakistan's international border. Well, guess what? India did. Similarly, Kargil, if you think about it, was it really strategic? We go up the hills, we go up the mountains, we take the heights, and then we threaten India's highway, a strategic highway linking Srinagar to Leh. What happens when India fights back? And does the international community really support us? Look, I, as a Pakistani, do feel that Pakistan had a strong case on Kashmir. I am not one of those who feels that our case on Kashmir was wrong, especially in the beginning. But here's the problem. Strategy needs several steps to be thought through. Step one, if it does not succeed, what will be step two? If it succeeds, what will be step two? What will be step three after that? What is the end game? And I think by making it into an emotional, sentimental issue in which basically people are just emotionally vested is essentially a way of keeping the people of Pakistan politically engaged. It is not necessarily a solution of the problem.
Except the bizarre part is that given the importance, the time and the effort that Pakistan has put into the Kashmir issue right from 1947 till today, how do you explain this lack of or even absence of strategic thinking? After all, Jinnah once called Kashmir the jugular vein of Pakistan. How can Pakistan's rulers be so cavalier about what is their jugular vein?
Well, Karan, look, I have written a book and I want people to read the book. And in that book, they will find that it's not just Kashmir and the lack of strategy about Kashmir. A lot of things in Pakistan, unfortunately, have been ad hoc. For example, in 1947, India and Pakistan became independent on the same day. Well, it took a year before Pakistan figured out that it shouldn't be celebrating its Independence Day on the same day as India. And so we changed from celebrating our Independence Day on 15th of August to 14th of August, which is the day that Lord Mountbatten came to Karachi and flew the Pakistani flag for the first time. Then India had a constitution within 2 years. We took several years, in fact, a total of 9 years before we had our first constitution, which was then abrogated by the army. The point being that a lot of homework that needs to be done to run a country was not done. Now, as a Pakistani, I want Pakistan to survive and thrive, which is why I keep making the argument that maybe we need to give up this ad hoc approach and this confrontational approach to others as a means of consolidating our nationhood, and instead start making longer term plans, which should include how to get along with our neighbors and do better economically and in every other respect. Since that was not the approach was, look, we got Pakistan as a result of an emotional slogan that Islam is in danger. Now we are going to consolidate the population of Pakistan behind Pakistan's very powerful military on the slogan of Pakistan in danger. And that has really been the bane of Pakistan's existence since 1947.
Let's come, Mr. Haqqani, to the Pakistani military, because that's another subject on which you have potentially dramatic things to say. You write, and I'm quoting you, Pakistan is not like other countries that raise an army to deal with the threats they face. Instead, you say, Pakistan inherited a large army that needed a threat if it was to be maintained. In other words, without the Indian threat, the Pakistan army would virtually lose its raison d'etre.
This should be seen in context. Now, India and Pakistan, their armies, both of them actually have the same origins. It was the British Indian Army that was raised by the British essentially for the Second World War. They did not demobilize it in time, and therefore 2/3 of it went to India, 1/3 of it came to Pakistan. The difference is that India got 83% of British India's GDP. So therefore, they were able to financially sustain it. But the other decision that India made was that there would be strong civilian control over the military. So while the military would continue to be it would be just a professional military like it was in colonial era, India's policies will not be defined by the military. Pakistan went the other route. We had only 17% of the GDP, but 33% of the army. So from the first day, our concern was, how do we feed this army? How do we pay for it? The military basically asserted control very early on, as early as 1951, I would argue. And they started thinking about how do we sustain the military. So General Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan, even Ziaul-Haq, they had not joined the Pakistan army. They had joined the British Indian Army. They were trained to think about the interests of the army rather than of the people or of the nation. And that crept into the policy making. And that, by the way, held Pakistan back both in constitutional and political terms, but also made the army kind of define Pakistan's national interest as the interest of the military. And so the military is in charge, the military defines national interest is defined from the perspective of what will benefit the military as an institution. It's only one angle, which is the military angle. Now, I do believe that Pakistan, like any country, needs a strong military.
Sure.
But that strong military needs also to allow other institutions of state to prosper and some civilian control over its thinking, because you remember President Eisenhower's famous words about a military-industrial complex. What he meant was that the military-industrial complex will only think about what is good for it, not what is good for the average American. And that is exactly what is happening in Pakistan.
In fact, you sum that thought up with the following sentence in your book. You say the Pakistani military realized that it will have to effectively control the country to be able to get the lion's shares of its resources. And the conclusion that comes to my mind is that the army rules Pakistan not because that's the best way of protecting the country's borders or even its ideology, which was the new spin General Ziaul-Haq gave it, but the reason Pakistan's army controls the country is because that's the best way of securing and protecting the army's own interests. If it doesn't control the country, it won't get the lion's share of resources.
Well, Pakistan is a typical national security state, and in any national security state, the people are made to live in fear. So we have to live in fear, and we have to live in aspirations that are not necessarily realizable. So it's not that important to get Kashmir, it's more important to keep telling the people that we have to get Kashmir. Similarly, it's not that important to actually fight wars and win them. It's more important to keep the people in the fear of the enemy and of the other. And I think that that has really harmed Pakistan. And unfortunately, it has become a way of thinking and a mindset. Now, I'm not saying people are insincere. I know many people in the Pakistani military who sincerely believe that we are constantly embattled. But unfortunately, the consequence is that Pakistanis live in the fear of India, we live in the fear of the United States, we live in the fear of Israel, we live in the fear of enemies within, we live in the fear of various ethnic groups that might want to break away from Pakistan. And because we live in fear, we are not able to evolve as a normal country or to have normal relations with any of our neighbors, except China perhaps.
Let's take a break at that point, Mr. Haqqani. When I come back, I want to turn to what your book has to say about India-Pakistan relations. You raise the question, who is to blame, India or Pakistan, for the fact that these two countries who are neighbors, which were once one country, keep quarreling with each other? I'm going to take a break and come back and discuss with you your answer, and more importantly, what your answer reveals about the future of India-Pakistan relations. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Come back, you're watching To The Point, and my guest is Husain Haqqani, who's just written a very important book about India-Pakistan relations with major revelations about the Pakistan Army, about Pakistan's attitude to Kashmir, and most importantly all, about the possibility of the ISI not only knowing about, but perhaps even being involved in the 26/11 attack in Mumbai. We turn now to what Mr. Haqqani's book says about India-Pakistan relations. Mr. Haqqani, you asked the question, who is to blame for the poor relations between India and Pakistan? And your answer is, and I'm quoting, both sides. But it has especially been made tangled by Pakistan's near pathological obsession with India. At another point in your book, you talk about Pakistan's paranoia, yet later you talk about its sense of victimhood, with India the principal victimizer. Finally, in your last chapter, you write, Pakistan ended up building its identity through opposition to India. To me, all of this is like suggesting that it's the existence of India that, in a sense, justifies the creation of Pakistan.
Well, I would say that both sides are responsible, because if one side is feeling paranoid, the other side can actually try and find ways of reassuring it. And I think that India has singularly failed in creating a sense of a reassurance among ordinary Pakistanis, if not among the Pakistani elite, which India could have easily done. Reassure them that we are not out to get you. I have a quote in my book from Jawaharlal Nehru going back to 1948 saying, I have enough problems of my own. I don't really want to take over Pakistan, the burden of Pakistan's problems. But that was never followed up. On the Pakistani side, as I already said, we have built a culture of fear. And yes, Pakistan being a Pakistani nationalist now unfortunately means being anti-India. Anybody in Pakistan who says maybe good relations with India will be good for Pakistan's economy or in many other ways is always labeled a traitor. So we have developed an identity that is solely anti-Indian. My fear is that in reaction, a similar process might be taking place in India, and there might be people in India who might focus so much on Pakistan, and we see some of them on your television screens, that they might actually feed the paranoia even further.
But the big difference, Mr. Haqqani, is that no one would say that India has built up its identity in opposition to Pakistan, whereas that is the precise sentence you use with regard to Pakistan. In other words, Pakistan
Absolutely, and I do acknowledge that in my book.
Pakistan defines itself as the opposite of India.
Absolutely, and that is something that needs to change for Pakistan's sake inside Pakistan. No country that has defined itself solely in opposition to another has been a successful country in history.
If this obsession is so deep-rooted, and indeed if Pakistan's identity depends upon its opposition to India, the question I want to ask, and I suppose it's a question that underlies your book, can India and Pakistan ever be friends and good neighbors without something like a dramatic sea change in Pakistan?
Look, I want Pakistan and India to be good neighbors, and I want it not for India's sake, although people in Pakistan accuse me of wanting what is good for India. No, what I want is what is good for Pakistan. And I personally think that Pakistan has huge economic problems. 42% of our school going age children do not go to school. India is 6 times larger in population, but maybe 12 times larger in the size of the GDP. India's GDP is growing at 7%, 6%. Pakistan would have to grow much farther, much more than the rate of India's GDP growth just to be able to keep pace. The military is the only area where we are moderately competitive, and in nuclear weapons, perhaps we have an edge. That is not a recipe for success for Pakistan. So what I'm hoping to do is, through this book, I'm hoping to ignite debate both on the Indian and the Pakistani side, and make people think the way we have conducted business in the last 69 years is definitely not something that gives reason for hope for the future. So therefore, we really have to change the approach fundamentally. And yes, you are right, a lot of that change would have to take place on the Pakistani side, but some on the Indian side as well.
There's no doubt that your book ignites a debate, but the problem is that the facts that your book presents, particularly if one comes to terror, and I use that as both an example as well as a foundational fact, you seem to suggest that in fact the use of terror by Pakistan against India will continue virtually for the foreseeable future. And this is because of the psyche or thinking of Pakistan rulers. I'm going to quote from your book. You say, as long as the belief exists that Pakistan must undermine India before India does the same to Pakistan, it's unlikely that terrorism will stop being an issue in the subcontinent. And clearly that belief exists, and very little is being done to dissuade Pakistan of it. So if you look at the facts suggest that you may provoke a debate, but the debate won't lead to the conclusion you're hoping for.
Well, I talk about terrorism in the context of asymmetrical warfare, meaning that the size difference is such that people think that we need to overcome the deficit of size by playing by rules that are not the rules. My argument is that terrorism has to absolutely end before other measures can take place. And at the moment, I don't see any hope of it. But let us be honest, terrorism is not a sustainable policy, and the blowback that Pakistan has been suffering will eventually result in the change that we all want. It's not happening now, and I'm very factual about it.
But what about your belief that Pakistan will continue to want to undermine India as long as Pakistan fears that India seeks to undermine Pakistan? That fear that Pakistan has, I imagine, is so deep-rooted that the response, we have to undermine India, will continue to be the Pakistani response virtually for the foreseeable future.
I hope that people who read this book will actually think of ways in which we can change that attitude, basically change the fundamental thinking that we have to undermine our neighbor, because undermining the neighbor is definitely not going to get the 42% of Pakistani school-age children who don't go to school into school. So if the thinking changes, then that could stop. At the moment, it's not happening.
I don't want to end this interview, Mr. Haqqani, without bringing up some of the other rather delightful nuggets in your book, which point in a very different direction. First of all, you say Jinnah wanted to return to his much-loved home in Bombay, which he had personally designed and built, after retiring as Governor General of Pakistan. How sure are you of this?
Well, he did make that request to Sri Prakasa, who was the Indian High Commissioner in Karachi at that time. Karachi was the Pakistani capital. Mr. Sri Prakasa wrote about it in his book, which was published in the 60s. But there was also exchange of letters, including some from Prime Minister Nehru to Mr. Jinnah, which are probably in the Indian archives. It is very interesting that you find it so, you're so incredulous about this. And that just shows how very little research has been done on either side of the border about each other. For example, there's
and forgive me interrupting, it also shows how little we in India know about Jinnah. how we've typified him as the villain without realizing that in many other respects he was a man that modern India perhaps would look up to and admire. His taste of clothes, his meticulousness, his smoking and drinking, all of those are aspects of Jinnah that we in India don't remember. Actually, Pakistan wants to forget some of them as well.
Yeah, you have caricaturized Mr. Jinnah instead of at least learning about him. For example, I can't think of a single person who can be described as a Jinnah expert in India. And that is why you find it incredulous. But the truth is, it is a fact that Mr. Jinnah did say that he wanted relations between India and Pakistan to be modeled on the relations between Canada and the United States. And he also said that once he retires as Governor General, he wants to go back to the city where he spent the most happy years of his life, and that city was Bombay.
Now, you also write that the man who was nominated as Pakistan's first High Commissioner to India was a certain gentleman called Muhammad Ismail. He was a UP Muslim who had not migrated to Pakistan. He considered himself Indian, and additionally, he had no intention of adopting Pakistani nationality. Once again, this is a gorgeous story. Are you absolutely sure of it?
Absolutely. In fact, Mr. Muhammad Ismail was Justice Muhammad Ismail of Gorakhpur. He is buried in Gorakhpur. He stayed Pakistan's High Commissioner from 1948 to 1952, never went to Pakistan, stayed on in Gorakhpur and died there. He was originally asked by Prime Minister Nehru to be a cabinet member, and he turned that down, saying, I don't want to be a cabinet member in your government because I'm not elected from anywhere. But he did accept being Pakistan's High Commissioner. And he thought, and in fact effectively did it, that he could be the Pakistani High Commissioner without actually moving to Pakistan. There was debate about it in Pakistan's Constituent Assembly. I have tracked down those debates and looked at those papers, and there is tremendous mention of this in another very good book called The Long Partition by a scholar of Pakistani origin at Brown University in the United States. And that's what led me to investigate this whole thing. And apparently there's a lot of mention about it in the newspapers of that time. So sometimes reading old newspapers is useful. I've done it for the readers. I hope that they will all read my book and find out these little nuggets.
But the amazing thing is that Pakistan's first High Commissioner to India was an Indian citizen. And he felt able to be both an Indian citizen and yet a good, effective representative of Pakistan and India. And I suppose that story tells us something of the nature of the relationship at that time between the two countries, which is so different to the way we perceive it today.
From 1947 to 1951, there was no citizenship law, and so therefore there were many people who were moving back and forth. For example, Mr. Jugendranath Mandal, who was from Calcutta, a scheduled caste leader, he came to Pakistan and served as Pakistan's first law minister. And in 1950, he changed his mind. He didn't want to be in Pakistan anymore, so he went back to Calcutta. Then Mr. Sajjad Zahir, who was from UP, he came to be the leader of the Pakistani Communist Party. And he got arrested and was charged and convicted for sedition. And then in 1950, he took the plea that he was an Indian citizen and was deported to India after having been convicted while he was in prison, and went on to be a very famous writer and poet in India with communist sympathies. So my point being, he was leading a Pakistani political party, the Pakistan Communist Party, and yet he was still an Indian citizen. And I think that that basically showed how there was considerable flexibility, the borders were not hard, and while there was anger and resentment resulting from partition, there was also a willingness on the part of the civilian political leaders on both sides who liked dealing with each other still, even though they had two separate countries.
What a wonderful story, and what a wonderful way to end this interview. It's a wonderful illustration of how we've been there, we were capable of it once upon a time, and that perhaps if we try, we can go back to the relationship we once had, where we can both share in each other's government, claim to be citizens of each other's country without in any way being disloyal to our own. Husain Haqqani, thank you very much for this exclusive interview.
Pleasure being here, Karan.
That was Husain Haqqani talking about his new book, which is released later this month. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.